Amrou Sharif, and he's the owner of Teclution. We've been talking about smart communities, and let's find out from him.
I understand you have some questions.
Yes, sir. Now, you have been there in the panel for smart communities. What is a smart community?
Could you repeat them? The line is not that clear. Go ahead.
What is a smart community?
In my opinion, a smart community is a community that's unified, that understands what their goals are, what they want to achieve. I mean, we talk about technology a lot, and coming from a technology background, infrastructure is all there. But really, to be a smart community, you got to know what you want to do as a community and be able to have a say in how you go forward, so that it's well aligned, and then as a community you compete with other communities. That's a smart community.
Okay, and why should we have a smart community? Why is is it a global trend that we need to follow, or is it making better sense?
Well, if you want to have a future in which you're satisfied, the next generation, the generation after you, can enjoy the same community that you're living today. You've got to be smart about that. It's just a natural need. I don't think I think it's maybe a buzzword being used, but it's a natural need that all communities, if they want to evolve and compete, need to have that oneness, that ambition that they all share, maybe around underlying traditional values that are acceptable. And in Oman, we're quite diverse, and we're quite tolerant, and we're all equal. And those are incredible values that other communities have strived for over many years. We have those in Oman and Muscat and the surrounding region. And if we can stand upon those values, come together, be smart about what we want to do, and compete, we can evolve.
It's interesting.
It's needed.
It's interesting you said to bring and unify a community. In the past, in the olden days, communities were so involved, you knew each other's neighbors. Today's world, we don't, and we have so many strangers on our friends list on our social media. So it's interesting you're also applying technology to bring and unify the community. How would you do that now? Where do we stand, and what should we need to reach that smart community level?
That's very good. In the breakout session that I was moderating, I asked this question: what's missing? What do we need? And the lead person said, look, back in the days in Matra, we would all sit down every weekend, we'll discuss.
Exactly.
We had that engagement. Engagement is something that needs to occur in our tradition, our culture. We have the majlis. People can approach decision makers and discuss issues. As you grow as a community, so does your population. This single, individual approach is not as efficient, and we're also even more busy nowadays, and we can't keep track by just making visits to the local government agencies and asking and inquiring what's happening.
Right.
And that's where technology comes in. It allows you to reach out to the community, to be able to absorb and engage the community, and also allows the community to keep track of progress, and the community to be satisfied that progress is occurring. And the more you engage the community, and the more you involve the community, and everybody is together, and using technology, the more you achieve or get closer to being a smart community that can compete.
Very, very interesting. So, where do you think, and how soon do you think we can achieve becoming a smart community?
Well, I think in terms of infrastructure, Oman is ahead of the game in technology. This is one of the few places I can leave and come back with an ID card. I think every resident in Oman can leave the country and enter the country with just an ID card. You can pay for parking. The technology is there. The infrastructure is there. Their tradition and engagement is there. But we have to address how we can address the mass now. We have to allow people to feel that they have ownership They have to be engaged. They have to take ownership in developing their own community. We can't centralize and control everything as much as it is nice to depend on a big brother to look after you. It's overwhelming. And the community now has to take ownership and be able to support in that area. So we can evolve. So I think it's quite, we're quite along the way. The biggest hurdle really is a acceptance of equal, ideas or a unifying platform which we can strive forward to get the message out and have the feedback and have put the technology to work to overcome whatever obstacles we have in terms of communication back and forth and keeping track and performance indicators. That's what we need.
But one final question, and that is the generation gap. Do you think the youth is so way ahead with the technology, but the rest of the community maybe not still? And do you think some areas are ready for it and some areas in Oman are not yet in par with the others when it comes to that technology transfer?
Okay. Well, that's another point. I think the wisdom in our community is very important. The older generation, the feedback is extremely important. We retire our wisdom in Oman at the age of 60. It's the retirement age over here. And we need to engage that community. The generation gap or the technology gap between the generations does exist. However, it's not inaccessible to the senior community. No doubt, the younger generation, my 10-year-old is programming one of these games, do stuff that I would never have dreamt at 10 years old, and they have their smartphones, and the penetration is all there. But the senior community also, with the technology and the ease of use of the technology now, can have access to that. They're not a majority of the population, but they're a very important part, and we need to utilize them and reach out to them. So I think that the difference in being able to use the technology between the senior and the junior population is there, but it's not a difficult thing to achieve, and it's just a couple of generations of work, and then after that, it's just a temporary solution. Eventually, we will have a well-connected, and the entire community will be well-connected.
We were also thinking about older generations and the legislature.
What I was thinking about is sometimes there's a gap when it comes to also legislation. So the older generation is making legislation and rules for new technology, and then sometimes there is sometimes a gap because it's the new millennials who will basically step up and use this technology. So now you have, of course, older gentlemen or older people like baby boomers, for example, making legislation for new technologies and stuff like that. Is there a plan in place to sort of close that gap between the two, so there is progress, or something
All right. of the sort? I'm going to repeat the question because you broke out. So you are asking for the older generation, let's say in the 80s and above, and who don't have the capability of or access to the technology.
No, Engineer Amrou. The topic changed actually. Marcus was asking you about, actually people who would make the legislature sometimes is older than the people who are actually using and applying technology. So there could be a generation gap even there.
I see. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that you see, those sort of questions, okay, to answer those sorts of questions or to make those sorts of conclusions, you really do need the information. I'm not sure that the legislation is being made by an older generation. I mean, those sort of that data is not available. That's another thing. We need to lay out this data. I don't want to avoid the question, but the legislation has a lot of culture and tradition involved in it, and there might be differences of opinions, but do we really know what we want? I mean, do we hear the people who are the loudest, but it doesn't necessarily mean those are that is what the community wants.
That's exactly.
And I think the flow of information does need to travel, and the legislation needs to give feedback and go back and forth, so we can actually understand who's making the decisions here. Are they really older?
That's exactly the point I was trying to get to. Whereas the people who are sort of saying, okay, this is great technology. How do we use the benefits of this? Whereas we still have the people of Oman to worry about. Whereas the technology wants to grow, because usually technology grows faster than governments can keep up. And it's the same thing with social beings, especially with social media. Whereas social media has grown so fast, it's like now scientists and governments are starting to catch up with what the implications of social media can mean, right? So it's when
but Oman's policy-wise, it's always like wait and then apply it.
Right.
See the results and the impact in other cultures or countries. And then see where are the problem areas, and then use a refined version. Then, accepting it. So I understand. The question is sort of who is finally deciding what is the right time, and but I guess it's a question of making sure what are the errors, what are the side effects, and then applying it. Engineer, are you there with this? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Because you're breaking up. So, was that a comment or a question?
That was a comment. That was just a comment from me. Well, Marcus was discussing it. Because from what I've observed in Oman is Oman tests, make sure how it is having its impact in other parts, and then apply it.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. Social media is becoming the de facto news agent nowadays in Oman.
Yes.
This is a good discussion that came up, and that is basically, these apps and applications and tools for cities and condensed areas. Has been starting in the West. Maybe you have lots of social tools being built up. I really wonder how much of an impact those social tools have had in the West and the East, as much as they've had in the Middle East, because we, over here in this region, it's become a necessity to have WhatsApp now. If you don't have WhatsApp, you're not connected. You don't know what's going on.
You're isolated.
You're absolutely isolated. And so, these driving factors, they didn't initiate over here, but they were very, very, very much needed. We did have forums online, and when the availability of forums were there, people used them.
Yeah.
And we are using this, and today was Dr. Salim from IPA. The recognition is there in the government. They understand the benefits of the communication that we can have with these social apps. And there is a change in the air. There is a change in the air in the sense that there is outreach. We've grown infrastructurally for the past 40 years really well. I mean, we have a lot of infrastructure in place. Now, how do we utilize that and go forward? And that's all got to do with the community. If the majority of employment is with the government, and we govern very well. But who's doing all the work then? Who's developing? Who's building enterprise, and who's competing? So now it's time to take advantage of that infrastructure, loosen up a little bit in the government, and share the burden of going forward.
And people taking responsibility.
Exactly,
Very, very interesting, Engineer Amrou Sharif, owner of Teclution. Thank you very much, and you have a brilliant day today.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. And there he was just enlightening us on smart communities, and we are sort of reaching there even with our social apps, as he pointed out, and it's interesting,
Well, that's because smart communities, he was talking about, smart communities being interconnected, and basically our interconnectivity is what makes smart communities help develop and grow, especially if you want to develop things. And then social media, of course, is playing a giant role in that. And the thing is, when you want to grow a community, of course, we have other factors that affect the growth of the community. So, like, who's running the community, who's doing this in the community, and that's why the question was about the social media. The technology is advancing so quickly that sometimes it's hard for the rest of us to catch up with it. So, how do we
and what is okay, what is not okay,
and how to find that balance, right? And that's what he was also mentioning too, how social media is now the de facto news. Like, if you want to learn what happened, just go on your Facebook news feed and see what happened, right?
And also, today, like, morning conversations begin like, did you hear that? Did you see that? Didn't I send that on WhatsApp? Could you share that?
The thing is, the water cooler gossip now, instead of just being within the office, is now spread worldwide.
Yes.
So that's one thing too, where you have to sort of like, we have all these things happening, but you have to sort of realize what's true and what's not. There should be a filter there, and this is where I'm saying that we need to catch up with that sort of stuff. So because the technology is blown up so fast, and now everyone's so interconnected that you just can't believe what you're reading anymore. What's a real source? What's not a real source? Oh, I heard this. Oh, I heard that. And basically people need to be educated, essentially, like what's real and what's not when it comes to that sort of media. And so once people understand what the true facts are or what are happening, you can truly become a smart community and then help expand technology-wise and socially.
Interesting. And with that, we'll go for a short break, and then when we come back, it's going to be architecture, and Peter Oborn is going to tell us more about it, and sustainability when it comes to that. And buildings and structures are definitely part of our culture and reflection and heritage. Stay with us. And the discussions have been excellent. Joining us now is Peter Oborn. He's from the Royal Rebirth Architects, and welcome to our program. Mr. Peter? Hello?
Hello?
Hi, welcome to our program.
Hello, I can only just hear you, I'm sorry.
We will try to do our best. Peter Oborn, I understand you've been here to Oman 30 years ago.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say that's true.
And you should be very proud, because that's why it's going to be a very interesting conversation.
No, he's just dating himself. He just feels really old now.
Don't worry. But it's for me to get an feedback later on in our conversation. But you're an architect, and what was the first impression that came to you when you came back 30 years?
I'm so
later.
Sorry, you're so faint I can hardly hear you. Did you ask the question, what was my impressions coming back after 30 years?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So yes, well, when I came here in 1980, it was 10 years after the accession of His Majesty, and Rui was just developing, and I lived in Medinet Caboose, which was out in the suburbs at that time. So the city that I've come back to is clearly, in many ways, very, very different. I mean, it's hand, and on the other hand, in some respects, nothing's changed. From an architectural perspective, in particular, still building in the same way, and a certain amount of urban sprawls developed. So public transport, for example, is clearly a challenge that's being met now, or going to be met in the years ahead with the railway and such like. So in one sense, it's grown a great deal. In another sense, things are very familiar.
Okay. Now, yes, it's very interesting to hear it from you, because you're an architect, and you have
one of the interesting things about our panel when we started was, because we were quite a diverse group, we spent a bit of time looking for a definition of what we meant by sustainable development, and I think that the definition that we arrived upon was one in which sustainable development means meeting the needs of the present without depriving future generations. So when you think about sustainable development in those terms, as you rightly say, you need to think about the future, not just the present, and whether we're using resources in the most efficient way, whether we're minimizing waste, and whether we're being efficient. And I think in that respect, when you then look at what's happening here in Oman, there are clearly opportunities to introduce, better insulation standards, to perhaps look at housing density, public transport, which I touched upon in terms of addressing the issue of road traffic accidents and such like, because sustainability from an architect's perspective isn't just about the environment, it's also very much about the social and the economic context in which one's operating. And for that reason, sustainable growth, I think, really sat very well in the context of this forum, because sustainable development and competitiveness go hand in hand. If you don't have sustainable development, you can't be competitive.
True. And if you're not competitive, you cannot have sustainable growth.
Exactly. And then there's a third component, actually, which I know underlines the work of PIPED here in Oman, which is this issue of national identity. And I think, architecture clearly has a very strong a role to play in national identity. And when we were talking about building standards that currently exist and what might be done to improve them, one only has to look at the way in which Omanis used to build in the past and how well they lived in contact with nature, and how much in harmony they lived with the country. To look at the architectural influences that one might draw upon when one thinks about how to build more sustainably in the future.
And also, I'd like to ask you in the same way, when we look at ancient buildings, they're still there today in the world to tell us a story. However, the buildings we've had, I guess, I'm talking about the whole world scenario, maybe from the 70s on, or even before that, 60s, are not equally, or the modern day buildings, are not able to sustain itself as much as these ancient buildings do. What's the difference?
I completely agree with you, and I think this is the difference between a pre-industrialized society and a post-industrialized society. Once we achieved the means in terms of energy and the technology, in terms of the systems, we were able to work independently of nature. And I think what the buildings of the past remind us is how well we lived how much we lived so much more harmoniously with nature in the past. And certainly from an architectural perspective, this is really reflected in the whole concept of what we call passive design, which is really a technique of designing with nature, using natural shading, using the characteristics of materials, thick walls for insulation, deep window reveals to reduce solar gain, things like the wind tower to get ventilation in the building without the need for air conditioning. There are all sorts of lessons that we can learn from what we see in the buildings of the past that will inform the buildings of the future. And that doesn't mean that we have to return to the way in which things were, but rather it means we recapture the spirit of the buildings that were here in the past.
And that spirit is working with the nature and environment. Exactly.
And it defines your culture. It defines your identity. So, as I said, sustainable development, economical development, and the whole issue of national identity are very much one and the same thing.
Very, very interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Peter Oborn, and I hope you get to see more of Oman.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with that, it's an interesting conversation with the architect, Mr. Peter Oborn, who is also there as a member of the panelists, talking about sustainable growth. And he must have obviously brought in architecture and sustainable growth. And it's interesting, how we've changed. And a very important point he brought about how in the past, which we've been talking earlier on, and also because he was an intern that time. That again goes back to our discussion of yesterday, where we think internship is an excellent way to bring up the youth into the mainstream. So stay with us on 90.4 FM. Marcus is getting ready. It's time